Thanks, Anna. So hello and welcome everyone to this webinar on MedDRA coding basics. My name is Suzanne Mansour Shakir or Shaker, both are correct. I will be your instructor for this webinar, and joining me is my colleague, Hannah Eaton. Hannah is an MSSO training coordinator and she will kindly facilitate our session today. I am a medical officer with the MSSO team. I'm based in New Jersey on the East Coast of the United States, and prior to joining the MSSO, I spent about 20 years in the industry, mainly in the world of clinical research. So in today's webinar, we'll be using the PollEV polling tool. We'll have some hands-on exercises later on. The tool is anonymized, and even if it asks you for a username, you can skip that part. It can be accessed either via the URL or the QR code that you see on your screen. If you log into the tool now, we can get to know you a little better with a few questions, starting with where you're calling from. But I'll give you just a few seconds to get the QR code. And the details are also in the chat on accessing the tool. Okay, so where are you calling from today? It's wonderful to see all the pins starting to show up on the map. And as more pins get added to the map, just a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is scheduled for 2 hours with a primary focus on introduction to coding with MedDRA. We do invite you to check the scheduled offerings if you're interested in furthering your knowledge of MedDRA, as we offer webinars on advanced coding, as well as data retrieval and analysis, among other topics. As we go through the slides today, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat on the right corner of your screen, and Hannah will bring them to my attention. We will also open it up for Q&A at the end. So welcome everyone from all over the world. Happy to have you with us. We appreciate you taking the time in your day, whether it's early for you or late for you. Welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see all these pins on the map, but in interest of time, we'll move on. Okay, so what primary role or roles do you perform either in your current organization or in previous lives? And you can pick as many as apply to you. I think it's wonderful to see how MedDRA plays a part in the activities of so many different teams and functionalities. It shows how truly adaptable MedDRA can be. And I hope you come away from today's session with the sense that MedDRA is a tool at your disposal meant to be leveraged to best assist you with your different roles and operations. So I see representation from all over today. This is wonderful to see, mostly, again, usually pharmacovigilance or drug device safety. But we have folks from all over the spectrum of the industry. Welcome to you all. And the last question for introductions is, how familiar are you with MedDRA? Because this is a basics webinar, we do expect most attendees to be early introductees to MedDRA. So I do see that represented here as well. Okay, awesome. So before we get started with the meat today, this is our disclaimer and copyright notice. Just as MedDRA is owned by the ICH, these slides are also owned and copyright protected to the ICH. However, with the exception of the MedDRA and the ICH logos, these slides and the information within them can be used and incorporated into other works, so you can share them with your own teams. However, if you make any changes, adaptations, translations, or any tweaks in any way, please clearly demarcate them and avoid any references that those changes were endorsed or sponsored by the ICH. The second bullet point is our warranty, that the presentation is provided as is without warranty of any kind. And the third would not apply. We don't have third-party material today. So in today's course, we'll go over a bit of MedDRA's scope, structure, and characteristics. We'll discuss coding conventions and learn about the ICH-endorsed coding conventions points to consider. We'll walk you through a demo on the MedDRA browser for the WBB, for the web-based browser. And we'll use this browser to show you a few examples on coding with MedDRA, and some of them will be hands-on. So we have provided you with temporary credentials for login in the chat feature as well. You'll find those temporary credentials, and we'll conclude with a Q&A at the end. So when we talk about the history of MedDRA, I think one of the interesting things is that it's linked to the history of the ICH. In fact, when you look at the our website, so this is our website, On the top right-hand corner, you're going to see the logo for the ICH, which takes you to the ICH homepage. And they have a snippet about their history talking about the need to harmonize. So different regions of the world went through different phases for their realization that there needs to be an independent evaluation of medicinal products before they are allowed on the market. And usually this realization came on the heels of tragedies like the thalidomide tragedy in Europe in the 1960s, where many pregnant women were exposed to thalidomide thinking it's a safe analgesic and useful for the morning sickness, when in fact it led to just horrific congenital deformities in many offsprings and intrauterine deaths as well. But that led to a rash of rules and regulations trying to standardize the technical requirements for manufacturers was challenging. That led to the idea to harmonize, which proved successful in Europe in the 1980s. And then it was joined by the US and Japan, which became the founding regions of the ICH in 1990. And the ICH were quick to start work on their products for their guidelines. So most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the ICH guidelines on quality, safety, and efficacy, but there's also a multidisciplinary guideline group, and the first of them is actually the MedDRA terminology. So MedDRA is an M1 ICH standard or an M1 ICH guideline. Okay, going back to our slide, this kind of explains the slide then. MedDRA was developed under the auspices of the ICH, but the activities of the MSSO team are overseen by the ICH MedDRA Management Committee, which is composed of ICH parties, MHRA of the UK, Health Canada, and WHO as observer. MedDRA is clinically validated. It is an international medical terminology. So clinically validated, meaning that the maintenance of MedDRA, any edits made to MedDRA go through review by a group of qualified international physicians who are experts in MedDRA. The scope of MedDRA encompasses medical, health-related, and regulatory concepts pertaining to the biopharmaceutical industry, and not just for drugs, but also vaccines, biologics, devices, drug-device combinations, and other products which are regulated in at least one region, like food or cosmetics. MedDRA terminology applies to all phases of development of medical products for human use. The one exclusion is the animal toxicology. The terminology developed for regulators and the regulated medical product industry in both pre- and post-marketing phases of the regulatory process applies to different phases like clinical studies, reports of spontaneous adverse reactions and events, regulatory submissions, regulated product information. So typical documents you'll see MedDRA in are the CSRs, the ICSRs, the investigator brochures. Even in countries that allow direct-to-consumer advertising, those terminologies are also MedDRA terminologies. When we think of what's included in MedDRA, it's the blue circle. Whatever's inside the blue circle is inside the scope of MedDRA, and outside the blue circle is outside of the scope of MedDRA. When we look at the examples that are outside of the scope of MedDRA from the perspective of data collection design, these tend to be data that is already standardized and summarized without the need for MedDRA. So for example, the type of clinical trial design, whether it's a double-blind or a single-blind or a cohort study, patient demographics, so MedDRA does not collect age groupings, gender or ethnicity details. However, we do have a few exceptions where gender is relevant to the medical concept in MedDRA, like the differences between male versus female breast cancer, for example. In age groupings, some age groupings may be relevant to certain medical conditions, like neonatal or newborn conditions. Some elderly conditions as well may be relevant as a medical concept. So those kind of exceptions may be found in MedDRA, but age groupings in general are not. Frequency qualifiers like frequently, rarely, this event occurred X number of times. Those kind of terminologies are not found in MedDRA, but you might find certain qualifiers in a handful of terms like intermittent, the qualifier intermittent. Same for severity descriptors. So mild, moderate, severe is not in MedDRA, although there are Again, a few exceptions to that rule, like mild versus severe mental retardation is significant to that particular medical concept. For results, we have textual qualifiers like increased, decreased, normal, abnormal, but we won't find numerical value for results within the scope of MedDRA. What MedDRA is scoped for is standardizing and summarizing clinical terminologies. So you'll see signs, symptoms, diseases, diagnoses, therapeutic indications, including prophylaxis of disease. You'll see names and qualitative results of investigations, like we said, increase, decrease, positive, negative, normal, abnormal. You'll also be able to find terms for surgical and medical procedures, for medical and social history and family history, medication errors, product quality issues, and of course, standardized queries. So although social circumstances are usually not regarded as medical terminologies, they do fall within the medical scope of MedDRA if they are relevant to the evaluation of regulatory data. For example, in the assessment of clinical outcome of treatment in the light of exposure to certain risk factors, like foreign travel is found in MedDRA, substance abuse, tobacco use, bereavement issues, and so on. The structure of MedDRA is hierarchical. It has 5 levels, and you can approach it either from a top-down or a bottom-up approach, and they are linked vertically. So each level from the bottom is subordinate to the linked term in the level above it. Those on top are superordinate to the ones linked to them in the level below it. The level at which you interact with MedDRA when you're coding is the lowest level term, the LLT on the bottom of the screen. This is the most granular level of MedDRA, meaning it has the most number of terms, with about just under 90,000 as of version 27. When you're coding in MedDRA, what you're doing is you're selecting a diction or a textual code, meaning an LLT within MedDRA that best reflects the medical concept you have in its natural language, your verbatim. So basically, you look at your verbatim, and then you're looking at these groups of LLTs, and you're choosing the one within MedDRA that best matches the information you received in your source. Some of the LLTs are actually close to each other, so they're conveying the same medical concept. These are considered sibling LLTs or sister terms that they mean the same medical concept, but they allow for multiple ways of describing this same medical concept, trying to give different options to reflect how the term may be reported in real practice under its natural language. So for example, you might receive reports for abdominal pain or belly ache or abdominal cramp and such, but they all mean the same medical concept. The LLT terms that are grouped as equivalent, if they represent a single medical concept, they are sibling LLTs like we mentioned. They could be semantically equivalent or they could be synonymous, as long as they mean the same medical concept, but they might therefore offer a few more details than their sibling LLTs. However, one of these grouped equivalent LLTs is considered preferred to the rest to represent this standalone medical concept. And this preferred LLT becomes the preferred term. So this one LLT is copied over and repeated at the preferred term level. So just saying that explains that every single preferred term in MedDRA is duplicated at the LLT level, both in text and numeric code. As you go higher up the hierarchy, the related PTs get grouped together in the next level, so the high level term, and this is the first grouping term, so the HLT. And this grouping of related PTs could be based on anatomy or pathology or physiology or function. Related HLTs also get grouped at the next grouping level, which is the high level group terms, HLGT. And HLGTs themselves get grouped into 27 system organ classes, either by site of manifestation, which is the most common, or by etiology or by purpose. So notice how the number of terms available per each level contracts significantly as you go higher up the hierarchy. The most numerous are the LLTs, and the least numerous are 27 system organ classes. We call them SOCs for short. So now we see how signals can get condensed, starting from the natural language, the verbatim, as it goes through MedDRA in the LLT, starting at the LLT level, all the way through to the system organ class. And in many organizations, summarization and analysis occurs at the preferred term level, at the PT level. So it's a very important level. It's also a level that can be used in reporting and submissions. And certain ICH guidelines for DSUR and PBRA actually reference PT as the level that needs to be included in the reporting. So this is a list of the 27 system organ classes. And as you can see, just looking at them, most of them represent body systems. So you have cardiac, you have ear, you have eye and GI, and so on and so forth. But some system organ classes represent etiologies like infection, neoplasms, congenital disorders, and some represent purpose, like investigations or surgeries. So certain system organ classes, like product issues as well, is a very important system organ class that represents a certain purpose, and so does social circumstances. So here's an example of the 5 levels of MedDRA in a simplified version. So this doesn't show all the possible options at each level, but it gives you an idea of how the terms become less specific the higher up you go in the hierarchy. And they tend to be single at the LLT PT levels, and in grouping terms, HLT and above, they tend to be in plural terms. So in the example of arrhythmia, at the LLT level, we have LLT arrhythmia NOS, which is not otherwise specified, and then standalone arrhythmia and dysrhythmia. They are all seen as representing the same medical concept. One of them is in red. So the one in red is the non-current. Non-currency in MedDRA only occurs at the LLT level. So LLTs that are non-current are color-coded red in the browser, and you'll see them similar to here with the red color denouncing that they are non-current and should not be used for coding. They are retained to preserve historical data for purposes of data retrieval and analysis, and they could have been made non-current because they are either possibly vague or may have been seen to be ambiguous, or they became outdated as new information became available, or they were found to have an error in spelling, for example, or they were truncated, and in truncated terms could be ambiguous. So another grouping of possible non-current LLTs, when MedDRA first started and it was first developed, it included terminologies from other ontologies like COSTART and WHOART and ICD that don't quite fit MedDRA rules for placement. So they were made non-current, and they can all be identified by the red box around the LLT. Now, in order for standardization to work, especially in electronic data exchange, the codes must also exist in numeric format. So each term in MedDRA, at whatever level it exists, is assigned a unique 8-digit code that does not change. But just for full disclosure, in very earlier versions of MedDRA, between version 2.1 to version 5, there was a small number of term names that changed MedDRA codes. But ever since version 5, the MSSO has not made any changes in the numeric codes of MedDRA terminologies. And these codes stay the same no matter what language of MedDRA you're using. However, they're non-expressive. So the code itself will not tell you which level of MedDRA it exists in, if it's an LLT or a PT or a system organ class level. The code will not tell you whether it's current or non-current if it's an LLT, and it doesn't tell you which SOC it exists in, so if it's a cardiac term or a GI term. Those codes are really very useful, and they are used in the E2B electronic submissions. So the next slide talks about the concept of multi-axiality in MedDRA. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because that concept might be a bit confusing to some folks. The LLTs connect to the system organ class by a path that usually depends on the site of primary manifestation. So if the medical concept represented in the LLT is a gastrointestinal concept, this would connect to the gastrointestinal system organ class. If it's a respiratory concept, it connects to the respiratory system organ class, and so on and so forth. But there are situations where the same medical concept could belong to more than one system organ class. And in this instance, MedDRA allows it to get linked to more than one SOC, more than one system organ class. So this is called multi-axial connections or multi-axiality. Of course, not every LLT or PT term is multi-axial in MedDRA. And if anyone is curious, LLTs can only connect to one preferred term. So there is no multi-axiality at the LLT level. Each LLT only connects to one preferred term level, but preferred terms can be linked to more than one system organ class via the HLT pathways. Multi-axial terms give you the option when you're performing data retrieval and analysis to group conditions that are similar to each other, regardless of which system organ class they exist in. So you can actually customize your data presentations accordingly. And this is covered in more details in webinars that talk about data retrieval and analysis with MedDRA. But since MedDRA is primarily a tool for standardization, each preferred term must be assigned only a single primary system organ class. So if a preferred term is a multi-axial preferred term, there has to be a primary SOC assigned, and that primary SOC would be the one displayed when you're doing your cumulative data outputs. And this, of course, prevents double counting of events. The selection and choice of the primary system organ class is predefined in MedDRA. It should not be changed at all by the end users. If you do change the predefined system organ class hierarchy in MedDRA, you're changing the M1 standard, the ICH M1 standard, and you're no longer using the standardized MedDRA that the regulators and the rest of the industry are using. So here's an example of a multi-axial term, obesity cardiomyopathy. So this clinical condition manifests as a cardiomyopathy. So it gets linked primarily to the cardiac system organ class, the cardiac SOC on the right hand of your screen in blue. However, the term is also related to obesity. So in MedDRA, it has a secondary link, secondary system organ class to the metabolism and nutrition disorders. Another example of a multi-axial terminology is influenza. So influenza is linked to the infectious system organ class via the etiology rationale. So it routes to the infections system organ class as a primary system organ class. It also has a secondary link to the respiratory system organ class because it has respiratory manifestations. So how is this primary system organ class assigned? There are rules for assigning the primary system organ class. Of course, if a preferred term is not multi-axial, then the only system organ class it links to is by default the primary system organ class for that particular preferred term. But PTs that are multi-axial and that represent diseases or signs or symptoms, usually they are primarily linked to their system organ classes that represent the site of primary manifestation. So, for example, if, like we said, if the medical condition is a gastrointestinal manifested condition, it will link primarily to the system organ class. If it's a respiratory manifested condition, it links primarily to the respiratory system organ class. But there are exceptions. So when we think about the exceptions, we want to go back and think about that thalidomide tragedy. It caused a lot of congenital deformities in different systems. So some newborns had congenital deformities in their arms and legs, and that's the most common vision that comes to mind when we think of the thalidomide tragedy. But other systems also were impacted, like the cardiac system, the gastrointestinal, the neurological, the renal, and so on and so forth. So in order for us to amplify that signal that the product led to congenital disorders, we need to be able to collect them all together, regardless of which body system was impacted. So the congenital system organ class is primary when a condition can be both congenital or something else. So the next slide talks about the priority, because what happens if the same preferred term can be both a congenital condition as well as, for example, a neoplasm or infection, because the three exceptions to selection of primary system organ class based on site of manifestation is not just based on that thalidomide tragedy for congenital disorders, but we're also interested in amplifying the signal if the product can possibly lead to neoplasms and malignancies, or if the product can possibly be linked to infections and infestations. So those three signals need to be amplified in your default reporting of your data. So the primary system organ class is always one of these three if they are included in the possible links of a specific preferred term. But if the same preferred term can be related to more than one of these three, then the order of priority starts with the congenital as the number one priority, and then the neoplasms, and then the infections and the infestations. So I hope this is clear, because multi-axiality tends to be a confusing topic for folks getting to learn about MedDRA brand new. If you do have questions about that, please do post them in the chat, and Hannah will bring them to my attention. There are system organ classes where preferred terms within that system organ class are exclusive to all else, meaning that preferred terms within these system organ classes will not be linked to any other system organ class. So there's three SOCs that are exclusive. They are the investigation SOC, the surgical and medical procedure SOC, and the social circumstances. And when you think about it, so if you run a lab test for a particular patient and you have results on that lab test, that result may be linked to more than one possible explanation, more than one possible medical condition. So it's really hard to ensure that all the possible links are there. And then you kind of disseminate the signal way too much. So you keep them all in investigations. Same for procedures and medical surgeries. If your patient underwent a certain procedure or a certain medical surgery, that surgery can be linked to so many different indications and medical conditions. Same with social circumstances. So if a patient is bedridden, that can be a risk factor for multiple medical conditions. So it makes sense to keep these kind of terms exclusive to the SOCs that they're in. However, as an important reminder, we need to keep these three SOCs in mind when we are performing data retrieval and query building, because we don't want to forget about them. So if we're querying conditions that are related to the cardiac system organ class and we're pulling up terms from the SOC for our query, we can't forget that there's possibly terms in these three exclusive SOCs that can be relevant to our query. So just something to bear in mind about these three SOCs. Before we go into more details on coding conventions, yes, Hannah, any questions?
Sorry, we just had someone asking if you could please repeat the last slide in summary, if possible, the multi-axial neoplasms infection slide.
Let me go back. Is this the one they're interested in? I mean, we can touch base on both of them. So when a preferred term is linked to system organ classes in MedDRA, the path that link is created depends usually on the site of manifestation, the primary site of manifestation. So if someone has a cough, that's represented or manifested in the respiratory system organ class. So the link would be usually to the site of manifestation. However, there are three exclusions or three exceptions to that rule of linking a PT to the site of manifestation. And those three exceptions are the following. If a term is a congenital condition, congenital meaning it is present at birth. So if something is seen at birth, then that link has to go to the congenital system organ class. The congenital system organ class has to be primary. If a condition is a neoplastic condition, so for example, skin cancer is a neoplastic condition. You'd think that it needs to be linked to the skin system organ class, which is true. It is linked to the skin system organ class, but it's also a cancer. It's a neoplasm. So it's also linked to the neoplasm system organ class. So which of the two would be the primary? Now, if a product is causing cancers, I'd be more interested in grouping all the cancers together in one system organ class rather than dispersing that signal depending on the site of the cancer. So the hierarchy in MedDRA would allow you to still be able to identify that these are skin cancers versus GI cancers, for example, in their secondary links. But I want that signal to be amplified in my default reporting, meaning when I run my listing and I'm looking at all my adverse events and I sort them by system organ class, I want to right away identify if there's a grouping or there's an issue under the congenital system organ class. I want to right away identify there's an issue there. Right away, I also want to identify there's an issue in the neoplasms or malignancies. Could there possibly be more cancers in the patient receiving this product? Same for infections and infestations. I want it to be amplified. So when the same terminology can be represented by multiple system organ classes, I have to have a primary SOC assigned. And if the link includes either of these three system organ classes, that becomes my primary SOC. So that becomes assigned as my defaulted primary SOC. But what happens if the same medical term can be linked to two or more of these three exceptions? Then I have to have a priority. So if I have a congenital infection, I identified that a baby was born with an infection, then the links in MedDRA can allow me to connect to both the congenital system organ class as well as the infection system organ class, but the priority for primary would be congenital. So I hope that answered the question, but if not, please give us a follow-up question and we'll be happy to address it.
Yes, they've just confirmed that you did answer their question. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's go back to our coding conventions. So coding conventions are really important. They are written guides and principles, of course, but the importance is to achieve consistency. I think one of the most important aims for any coding group is to achieve consistency. If you're consistently coding your data, you'll be able to aggregate them together and you'll have a better signal when you're doing your data retrieval. And of course, they harmonize the exchange of MedDRA coded data, and they address certain topics in organizations, like how you're handling any misspellings or abbreviations or acronyms. How are you approaching your combination terms that have more than one medical term reported in the same verbatim? And do you have any lists for do not auto-encode? So chest pain is a common example that many organizations query to clarify if it's cardiac or non-cardiac. And in my 20 years experience in the industry, I've never worked in an organization where they did not have organization-specific coding conventions. They could be at the organizational level, at the product level or indication level, and sometimes even at the study-specific level. And they are really important in addressing needs for different members of the coding team. So not everybody has the same background or aptitude or experience in coding, especially now that we've seen how MedDRA has a large number of LLTs. So the selection process needs to be consistently organized as much as possible. And of course, even for folks who have the capability to use autoencoders, we still need a manual review process because the autoencoders don't always get it right. So the autoencoders can approach a term, but not in a medically logical way. So the autoencoders look for matches dependent on the way the autoencoding tool is programmed, but there could be obvious errors. So these are real examples. So allergic to CAT scan was autoencoded as allergic to cats. And myocardial infarction in the fall of 2000 was identified by the autoencoder as two conditions for MI and fall, rather than, a part of the season, the autumn of 2000. So ICH also recognized the need for coding conventions, and they have created, through a working group, they have created ICH-endorsed coding guidelines that encompass coding guidelines for industry and regulatory purposes. Those coding guidelines are titled MedDRA Term Selection, so MTS, Points to Consider, PTC. So it's abridged as MTS PTC guideline. Because when you're coding in MedDRA, what you're doing is you are term selecting. You are selecting a term at the LLT level from within the LLTs available in MedDRA. So term selection basically means coding. The PTC guidelines facilitate consistent selections. So it is recommended to be the basis for each organizational specific coding conventions. And the ICH guidelines are released every March with the March version of MedDRA. It does offer complete versions in 6 different languages, and we have condensed versions in about 9 or so different languages. And these guidelines are provided on our websites for both the MedDRA and JMO websites. These guidelines also tackle the scenarios where there could be more than one option for coding or more than one option for term selecting. And in many of these instances, the guideline will offer you which one is the preferred option when there's more than one options. But this does not limit you to applying that preferred option. So they are titled points to consider, and that's exactly what they are. They are points to think about when you're approaching your coding. It is highly recommended that organizations are consistent with the ICH guidelines. But if they don't use the preferred option, that's also an open choice to the organizations. But it's recommended in that instance to please document that approach and, of course, ensure that it is consistently utilized across the organization. The ICH guidelines also offer a section 4 that touches on versioning, but it really refers you to the MedDRA best practices document that has a bit more details on versioning options. And versioning would be not the topic for today, but the ICH guidelines for term selection is. So these are some of the principles we'll be touching upon today from the PTC guidelines, starting with the quality of source data, quality assurance, not to change MedDRA, how to select the lowest level term, only using the current lowest level terms, when to request the term in MedDRA, and of course, always applying medical judgment in term selections and only coding what you receive. So let's start with quality of source data. Of course, quality of output also depends on the quality of input. And when you're thinking of data input or data resource or source terminologies in coding world, you can think of two types of source data. When you're coding, you have the verbatim. And when you're analyzing, you have your coded data. So those are two types of source data. So coding can be seen as a data entry. And of course, the quality of the original information will decide the quality of your data output. If able to, and you receive a report that is ambiguous, the recommendation, of course, is to obtain clarification from the reporter. The quality of the source data can also be optimized in your design for data collection. So that's an important step to think about before you actually deploy your database. And of course, proper training of the staff. So if the staff is aware of the impact of their reporting on the analysis via the coding step, that would be a good step in ensuring optimal quality. And as we mentioned before, the organization-specific coding guidelines, it is highly encouraged to be consistent with the MTS points to consider. Many of the coding teams that I worked on do ensure quality assurance by having a medical professional who is familiar with MedDRA review the final coding. And of course, if you are using any automated coding applications or tools, to have human oversight. One of the most important concepts when you are coding in MedDRA is not to change MedDRA. Don't change the hierarchy of MedDRA, even if you are able to. So some organizations figure out a way to change the primary SOC allocation. But if you do that, like we said, you are no longer then using the ICH M1 standard. If you make any changes to the hierarchy and structure of MedDRA, it is predefined. However, if you notice something in MedDRA where you disagree with the placement of a term or disagree with the primary SOC allocation of a term, by all means, please submit a change request to the MSSO and they all get reviewed. When we are thinking about general principles when we're coding, the first principle is we only use current LLTs. Like we said, the non-current LLTs, the ones with the red boxes, they are available in MedDRA for legacy purposes, but they should not be used for coding. So when we're coding, the first thing is we just want to make sure that we're selecting a current LLT. The second is we want to select one that most accurately reflects the reported verbatim. So there's a large number of LLTs in MedDRA. They try to convey different ways of saying the same medical condition, and some of them have a bit more details than others on the LLT level. So we want to try to find the LLT that is the most accurately reflective of our reported verbatim. So if we have an abscess on the face, and I look up in MedDRA and I find an LLT of abscess. So not that it's completely wrong, but it's not giving me the full details of the information I received, because there could be an abscess on the face. Yes, there could be an abscess in the lung. There could be an abscess in the brain. There could be an abscess on the skin, somewhere else other than the face. So when I look up LLTs in MedDRA, I want to try and find one that has all the details of the information that was received to me. So it's not just an abscess, but I also have the location. And in MedDRA, I will not be able to find abscess on face, but if I use just parts of the word or roots of the word and use FAC instead of face, I'll be able to find facial abscess. And again, just as a reminder that the non-current LLTs, even though they are available to you in MedDRA, they are available for legacy conversion or historical purposes, not to be used for coding. Another concept to think about when you're coding is that if you find yourself utilizing a lot of workarounds for coding particular term and you're just not finding it in MedDRA, so you can always request a new term to be added to MedDRA, and the MSSO team will review every single one of those requests. In fact, every version release we have in MedDRA, the most of the terms that get added to MedDRA are based on change requests from MedDRA end users. It's always a good idea to use medical judgment. So not every verbatim needs a change request to be added to MedDRA. There are terms that are medically equivalent within MedDRA that do represent the medical concept. So please utilize a medical judgment before submitting change requests for new terms in MedDRA. Okay, so another important concept when you're coding in MedDRA is to code everything that you received. So as long as your source information backs up your coding, you're fine. So two things from this slide. Of course, don't leave something uncoded, but also don't add information. Don't make assumptions and add information, because if your source does not corroborate your coding, then this is not information that you received. This is information you created. So here's an example. Let's say that you received a report that says abdominal pain with increased serum amylase and increased serum lipase. So maybe a medical reviewer on the team sees this and they are right away thinking that this is possibly a case of pancreatitis. That might be the case. That might be a case of pancreatitis. But your report that you received, that you are coding, did not specify that this was pancreatitis. It just gave you some signs and symptoms. So you can't assume that this is pancreatitis in your coding process, in your coding step. You can query the site if you're able to, or the reporter. You can query the reporter for more information and ask them, are you reporting a pancreatitis? But as it stands, this verbatim cannot be coded to the condition, because this is a group of signs and symptoms. We can't infer the condition. So in this particular example, the right approach would be to select more than one LLT, and that's what we call a split coding. Now, not everybody on the line today works in an organization where the database structure allows for split coding. So this is a conversation that needs to be had internally, because some databases will allow you to only code or only assign one LLT per verbatim. And some databases allow you to select as many LLTs as applicable for your verbatim. So the question about how do I capture all this information would be an internal discussion with your organization. Do you split them from the reporter? Do you query the reporter to split them? Do you somehow introduce any kind of steps internally to ensure that you are collecting all the information elsewhere? So those are questions that need to be had internally. The ICH term selection points do cover a wide range of topics, so we won't have time to go through all of them. We do offer a lot more details and topics in our advanced coding webinars, so you are welcome to register for the next offering of the advanced coding webinars. But this gives you an idea of what you can find in the document, in the ICH points to consider document. So you have death, you have suicide, you have when there are differences between age versus event specificity, or site versus event specificity. When you have a microorganism reported, how do you approach those? When you have congenital terms or procedures, and the list goes on. So you have other topics include misuse, abuse, medication errors, and these topics are mentioned in more details in the companion PTC document, and I'll show you in a little bit where to find those. Other topics like what do you do when you have a report that says there was a normal term or no adverse effect? What do you do with a term that gives you indications or off-label use or product quality issues? All of these topics are mentioned in the ICH Points to Consider guideline, and one way you can best utilize that guideline rather than read through it all and maybe risk not retaining most of it is when you are looking at a term or a report and you are figuring out whether the coding was correct or figuring out what to code it to, you can always try to find that scenario in the Points to Consider document and read through that section. And I think that helps bring the points home. Okay, so we're going to be taking a look at browsers, but any questions, Hannah?
We have a couple questions at the moment. The first one asks, are there any LLT/PTs that connect to multiple SOCs as site of manifestation? Or can PTs only have one SOC as the site of manifestation SOC? i.e.,
That's
a
a good
PT
question. Yeah.
cannot be in both respiratory and skin conditions.
So thank you for the question. PTs can be linked to multiple SOCs, and because many of these SOCs are themselves sites of manifestations, the short answer is yes. The same PT can be linked to multiple SOCs that can be sites of manifestations for that condition, and the decision as to which one becomes the primary system organ class is then made by the International Medical Officers team. So those group of physicians that review all the change requests and decide whether this proposed term belongs in MedDRA because it is a valid and unique medical concept, they have to make the decision as to which of the multiple SOCs it can link to becomes the primary. So in those kind of instances, a consensus call is scheduled with the physicians, and they decide as to which body system is the one where the manifestations are primary. So I hope I answered that question, but if not, please come back to us. And there's a second question, Hannah?
Yes, we had the next question is, if the LLT is a nasal cyst, would the primary SOC be respiratory system rather than neoplasm?
So if we go back to that slide, I want to just show you something in the slide. Okay. So the neoplasm system organ class has a long name. It has neoplasms, benign, malignant, and unspecified, including cysts and polyps. For the neoplasms, the primary SOC goes to the SOC neoplasms. The exception are the cysts and polyps. So if your terminology is a cyst or a polyp, then their primary system organ class is the site of manifestation. I don't really need to group them with the malignancies as a primary link. I mean, they are benign neoplasms, so they can be linked to that system organ class, but not as a primary link. So I hope that kind of answers why we have neoplasms, including cysts and polyps, and then an exception to cysts and polyps is that the neoplasms include the condition for cysts and polyps, but the link won't be primary to that SOC if that's the condition reported. So I hope I answered that question, but if not, please come back to us. And we were, I believe, on this slide for introduction to the MedDRA browsers. All right, so MedDRA offers 3 different types of browsers. You have the web-based browser, the WBB, the desktop browser, the MDB, and the mobile MedDRA browser, the MMB. And the browsers all allow you to search within MedDRA and search within the SMQs. That's, of course, the topic for the SMQ webinar, but you're allowed to search within the SMQs on all the different browsers. All the browsers will need, of course, the MedDRA ID and password to be able to access them. Since you are here with us today on this webinar, that means you do have a MedDRA ID and password. If you're not sure what they are and you're curious, you can look it up in the SSA, the self-service application tool on our website. You can find the link on the top right-hand corner. And all three browsers offer multi-languages for your interface, as well as all the languages that are available in MedDRA. I believe we have about 23 languages right now in MedDRA. The desktop browser will need to be downloaded. So, we have links, and I'll show you on our website, that allow you to download the desktop browser. And it has the same features, the same functionalities as the web-based browser. The only difference between the desktop browser and the web-based browser is that in the desktop browser, you have to select which MedDRA files you're going to be working on. So you need to download, for example, you want MedDRA English 27.1 and you want MedDRA English 27 and 26.1. You'll need to retrieve them from the website and download them to the desktop browser. And of course, the desktop browser allows you to work offline. So that's the biggest advantage in the desktop browser. But with every release of MedDRA, because we can't access your desktop browser, you'll need to upload the next release of MedDRA. So every time we have a new version, you'll need to grab it and download it to your desktop browser. All tools except, the difference with the mobile browser, and the mobile browser is a URL. It's not a tool, but it's designed to have a large interface so that it's easy to use it on your mobile screen. But it doesn't, of course, allow you to export your search results. That allowance occurs in the web-based browser and the desktop browser. The web-based browser has a advantage to the rest. So the web-based browser, of course, requires internet connection for you to be able to use it. But because it is a live browser, it is always up to date. So it has all the versions, all the languages, and every time we have a release, it exists in the web-based browser. And even before the release, there's something called supplemental information or supplemental view in the web-based browser. And the pink, the pink coloring will warn you that you are in the supplemental view, but the supplemental meaning that terms have been requested and for addition to MedDRA, and they have been approved for addition to MedDRA, and they will exist in the supplemental view, not yet in the release view, but you can see them ahead of the release. And that's the benefit of the supplemental view in the web-based browser. Okay, so I think the best thing is to show you what we're talking about. So at this time, we're going to do a browser demonstration. In your chat feature on your the right-hand corner of your screen, if you look in that chat on the bottom, you're going to see the temporary credentials for accessing the web-based browser. There's also a link in the chat. So feel free to log in to the browser with us, or you can use your own organizational's MedDRA ID and password, or if you have your desktop browser already, you can follow along on there. But I want to show you maybe starting with maybe a quick overview of our website. So this is the MedDRA website. This is the MedDRA landing page. You have the welcome notes in all the different languages that MedDRA supports. But on the top right-hand corner are the quick links that are very useful for our users. So the SSA, the self-service application, the one we talked about, if you're not sure what your MedDRA ID and password is, but you have an email that belongs to the domain of your organization, you can just plug in your email and it will email you your requested information. And you can also retrieve your training certificates from the SSA. Other quick links are, here's the WBB, but we'll do that last. But here's the points to consider link. So the ICH endorsed guidelines that we talked about can be accessed via this quick link. Under the PTC for points to consider, it will default or the blue ribbon toggled open. You can also access it under how to use. So the how to use tab is the one that's most useful to the MedDRA users because it has these support documentations. So I can access my support documentations either via the how to use or the PTC, but of course the PTC gives it just the blue ribbon is toggled open. Here's your ICH points to consider. So you can have it in PDF or Word version or HTML. It comes also with a red line version comparing the previous release. So like we said, it is released every March. There is a second ICH points to consider guideline that is ICH endorsed, talking about data retrieval and presentation. and it has its own webinars. So I do encourage you to sign up to those if you're interested in the use of MedDRA in data retrieval and analysis. And here's your points to consider companion document. And it was just released this September. So the companion document is not released every year with every March release. It is released as needed, and we had a brand new release just this past September. The companion document has a lot more details on certain topics of interest, especially product quality issues and medication errors, and now the manufacturing issues. And here's your MedDRA best practices that we said has a lot of information on versioning. If you toggle open the gray bars are version-specific guidelines. With every release of MedDRA, we do include them. And these talk about, what's new in that particular version, but also gives you an introductory guide on MedDRA, which is a really useful guide, especially for newcomers to MedDRA. It talks about how MedDRA was designed, with what in mind, and how to approach different things in MedDRA, like ordering of the words, capitalization, conventions, and things like that. And then you have your introductory guide for SMQs, and the distribution file format for those among us who are a bit more techie. So another thing I just wanted to show you under the training tab. So there's a nice offerings under webinars and face-to-face classes, as well as a training curriculum, which gives you a nice roadmap how to get more acquainted with MedDRA, with different links as well, on how to access seminars, webinars, video casts of the topics you're interested in. So going now to the web-based browser, it lands you on your login page, and right off the bat, I can change my interface language right from my login page if I so choose. So if I want to change my interface language, I can do it even before I access the browser. Okay, so the browser opens up to a couple of different panels. So across the top here, this long gray panel across the top, this is my configuration and tools panel, and it has some useful information in it. So one of the really useful information in it for coding purposes is my concept descriptions. The first blue button in my panel on top is my concept descriptions. So concept descriptions are not definitions, but they describe how concepts are utilized for coding purposes within MedDRA, and it is alphabetized. And it's not really long because it doesn't have every single possible medical concept in MedDRA, but it has medical concepts of interest. So for example, if I'm interested in medication errors and I click M, I can see a definition of what a medication, well, not a definition, a description of how medication errors are approached for purposes of coding within MedDRA. So this resource is very useful to you when you are coding in MedDRA. To the left here is my hierarchy panel. So I can see all my 27 system organ classes listed alphabetically based on the language that I'm interested in. So if I choose any of these 3 languages on the top, this can change the ordering of the system organ classes based on my first language, the one in yellow here. So if I change this, for example, let's change it to German, my system organ classes have changed in order based on the German alphabets. But I still see the English as my second because I kept my English selected. Of course, the tool defaults to English, but you can change up to 3 languages. So I can have German, Chinese, and English in the order, seen in the order of my languages. I can restore my defaults either via restore defaults, or this quick button here next to the MedDRA browser itself will restore my defaults. When I'm approaching coding from a top-down approach, and sometimes we tell you it's good to have a top-down approach, it means I at least have an idea of which system organ class I'm interested in. So if I have a cardiac condition and I want to code an arrhythmia, like that example we saw, I know I have an arrhythmia. So I can toggle open my cardiac disorders and I can find my arrhythmias and I toggle them open. So here's my system organ class. Here's my larger grouping terms, my HLGTs, like cardiac arrhythmias, cardiac valve disorders, cardiac neoplasms, heart failures, and so on. But I know I'm interested in cardiac arrhythmias. I can toggle that open, and that shows me the second layer of grouping terms, the higher level terms, the HLTs, that are groups based on the specific type of arrhythmia. So if I know I have a supraventricular arrhythmia, I can toggle that open, and here's a collection of all my preferred terms that are available to me. And each one of these preferred terms will include the subsumed or subordinate LLTs that are sibling LLTs grouped under it. So I can approach this from a top-down approach in coding. Now you'll notice that there are different colors of all these PTs. So what does this mean? So if the PT is housed in a red box, it just means stop right there. There are no other system organ classes linked to this particular PT. So a red box means stop, you are on the only system organ class that this PT is linked to. If the box is green, green means go. So it means that there are other system organ classes that this particular preferred term is linked to, but you're not on the primary. So this cardiac disorder is not the primary for this chronic atrial and intestinal dysrhythmia syndrome. If the box is blue, it means there are other system organ classes linked to this preferred term, but you are on the primary, which means that for this junctional ectopic tachycardia, the cardiac disorders is the primary system organ class, but there are other system organ classes. Well, how do I know which ones they are? If I just click on any one of these terms, I want you to pay attention to this huge, big right-hand sided panel on your right-hand side. This is the term details panel. It gives you all the detailed information of any term you click on. So just to show you an example, if I click on a blue boxed preferred term, I see a lot of information opens up on the right-hand side panel. It starts with what is the level of the term. It is a PT. It gives me the numeric code. It gives me the textual term itself, and it tells me which system organ class it's linked to. I now have this the SOC code and the SOC name and whether this is primary or not. It also tells me whether this preferred term exists in any SMQs. Of course, that's not the topic for today, but it's a useful bit of information for those interested in data analysis and retrieval. It also tells me how many system organ classes it's linked to in detail. So here's my term, and it's only linked to one system organ class, the cardiac disorder. Now, I already knew that there was only one because the PT was housed in a red box. And I know that this is the primary system organ class because the system organ class is housed in a blue box. If I click on a preferred term that has a green color, so here's my preferred term with a green color, my right-hand panel changed completely to show me the details of my term. And now I see that there are more than one system organ classes linked to this preferred term. There's actually 3 of them. There's a congenital system organ class, there's a cardiac, and there's a gastrointestinal. So going back to that question from that end user, and thank you for that question, can we have more than one links based on sites of manifestation? Yes, we can. In this particular preferred term, there are 3 system organ classes, but one of them is congenital. And because this can be a congenital disorder or a congenital condition, I need to amplify that signal as much as possible. So I need that to be my primary system organ class. So it defaults to congenital as a primary system organ class. So if you have this term in your data and you're running reports and you're outputting based on your primary system organ class, you're going to see the congenital system organ class. If I click on a blue boxed housed preferred term, I'm going to see that it is linked to multiple system organ classes, and the one I was on anyway was the primary. So the SOC housed in the blue box is the primary system organ class. So there is a button for legends to kind of help you understand all the color codes that we talked about. So if the preferred term is housed in a blue box, it means it is linked to more than one system organ class. So it is a multi-axial preferred term. And if you see it housed in a blue box in your top-down view, That means you are currently on the system organ class that is primary to that preferred term. If your preferred term is housed in a green box, that means it has links to more than one system organ class. So again, it is a multi-axial preferred term. But because it is housed in a green box, that means you have to go to find your primary system organ class. So the system organ class you're on in your hierarchical view is not the primary. And of course, if it is housed in a red box, it's a uniaxial. There's no other system organ classes linked to this particular term. The system organ class that is primary is always housed in a blue box. So there's no other colors for the system organ class. And the LLT that's housed in a red box means it's non-current, as we said before. So there's no other colors for the LLTs. So I hope that's kind of a quick look at the color legends. Okay, the middle panel is the one that everybody's interested in. So let me just restore my defaults and leave everything blank. So when I am coding in MedDRA, basically what I'm doing is I am typing in, if I want to, I can type in a word or a collection of words or parts of a word or parts of collections of words within my search panel to look up if I can find an LLT that is close to my verbatim. So like we said, we can do a top down by toggling open the system organ class that I'm pretty sure that my condition is listed in, or I can do a search function. So when I do a search function, just as a reminder, because I have multiple languages, I can research in different languages. But if I want to enable my research in those different languages, I have to select them first. So in my pull down option in my search panel, I can only see English because under my configuration panel, I did not select any other language. But I can choose, like we said, let's do Croatian and let's do Japanese. Now I can select which language I want to search in. So if my data that I received in my source is in a different language than English, I can still look it up in MedDRA in the language I received it in, if available, of course, 23 languages. So these are all the languages that are available in MedDRA, I think 23 so far, but we're working on more. I can also change the version of MedDRA. Now, you notice that when I'm selecting the version of MedDRA in this particular example, it only gave me 2. But we know MedDRA has more than just 27 and 27.1. That means that out of these 3 languages, one of them only exists as far back as version 27, and that's Croatian. But if I restore my default settings where I'm all English, and I try to find how many versions, I can go all the way down to 2.1. So 2.1 is the oldest MedDRA version that exists in the web-based browser. Now, let's say I'm researching something and I'm looking up something and I don't want to lose the information I'm looking at, but now I'm thinking of something else and I want to research that as well. I can just open a new browser window and I can open quite a few. So I don't need to forget where I was or forget what I was searching. I can just open a new browser window if I wanted to. And if I want to quickly take a look at what did the ICH guide, PTC guide talk about this particular scenario, I can quickly, well, this is the user guide. I can quickly access the MedDRA documentation. And it takes me back to those blue and gray ribbons, and I can access the ICH points to consider while I'm in the browser. Okay, so I think those are the things that I want to talk about. On the top here, we do have a couple of tools. So we have the SMQ analysis tool and the hierarchy analysis tool, but these are really topics for the data retrieval and analysis webinars. The advanced search is also another interesting one. Let me show you an example. Let's say I'm interested in general seizure. So if I put seizure and I hit enter when I'm looking, it gives me how many terms that it found throughout MedDRA, regardless of the level, that talk to seizures, including synonyms, because the defaulted box, if you look at the search options, it is defaulted to give you the following: LLTs, PTs, HLTs, HLGTs, and SOCs. It gives you all the levels. If I don't want them, if I'm just interested in LLTs, I can untick and repeat my search. And now I have a bit less to sort through. So I have 279. Another thing that it defaults to is using the synonym list. So synonym list is kind of a way to try to accommodate the natural language verbatims as much as possible. So think cardiac, for example, if you're looking up heart conditions, it will not just look up heart conditions, it will look up cardiac as well, or cardium or cardio. If you're interested in, we said, in seizures or convulsions, it will look up convulsions, convulsant, epileptic, epilepsy, seizures, and so on. So this is defaulted when you are doing your search. So it's already looking for those kind of connections for you. It ignores diacritical marks. So in certain Latin alphabets, there may be diacritical marks, especially, for example, the French language. So if you think Guillain-Barré syndrome, that has an accent in the French Latin alphabets, but the search option is defaulted to ignore that, so that it's not limiting the search within the MedDRA files based on those diacriticals. And it will tell you, now let's go back and retick the all the levels of MedDRA. It will tell you how many it found per level. So in these two rows within the gray box, it will tell you, okay, I found 376 terms within MedDRA that are related to seizure, but they're not all necessarily worded as seizure. And I found one in the HLGT level. So if I click on the HLGT lab, I'm going to see HLGTs of seizures. We do have an HLGT of seizures. We have an HLT. We have quite a couple of them. So we have 5 of them. We have 91 preferred terms. And then we have 279 LLT terms. Now, if I'm coding, I'm interested in the LLT terms. That's quite a lot to sort through. The output gives me different types of results. It will tell me if it found an exact match. So if I wrote out the whole word seizure, it's going to look for that entire word and tell me if it found it. If I just put SEIZ and I hit enter, it's not going to give me any exact matches because it's not going to find that. But let me go back to seizure. So I'm typing I'm coding a certain type of seizure, and I want to see if I can find it. It's showing me 2 other kinds of search results as well. It's telling me I found 183 LLTs where it's not exactly seizure, but it's a synonym. For example, epilepsy or convulsion. So I have all of these different options. And then it has a 4th category of results, which means it has found the word seizure contained within these terms. So it could be seizure or seizures. It could be in the beginning. It could be in the end. Now, that's a lot of LLTs to sort through. So if I can think of ways to maybe constrict my search, I know it's generalized seizure. Maybe I can add the word general. And see how many I find. So instead of 300 some results, I'm now looking at 30 or so. Another thing I can use is my advanced search. So if I go to my advanced search and my verbatim has the word general in the beginning, I can say I'm looking for something in MedDRA that begins with general and contains seizure. And then I'll tell it, now find me something. So now it found all the LLTs in MedDRA that begin with the word general or generalized and have the word seizure or its synonyms like convulsion. So that makes it a bit easier for me when I'm doing my search. And I can either go back to my basic search and start over if I'm interested in something else. Now, let's say that I have a condition and I know that it's maybe a congenital condition. So the baby was born with that. something that has to do with the eye, and I'm not sure where to start. So if I toggle open the congenital, and I'm not sure if I can really find what I'm looking for, there's just too many to sort through, or maybe I'm just interested to see what MedDRA comes up with for congenital conditions that have eye in them. So I can put eye, and here in the selected system organ classes, I can restrict it to only congenital. And now I'll tell it, now find me anything within the congenital system organ class that talks to the word eye. When I search, I'm limiting the search to only this system organ class. So I'm going to see a warning in yellow telling me that I'm limiting my search to the one system organ class. But this is helpful when I'm, for example, let's say I want to clear my selection and I want to look for eyelid, but I'm interested in the injury. I know that some kind of injury happened to the eyelid, so let me look at that. And yes, it can do that as well. It can show me terms that have eyelid within the injury system organ class. So that helps me also limit how many terms I need to sort through to find the one that's closest to my verbatim. I'll see the LLTs in the red boxes because in the top panel, I kept it as defaulted to show me my non-current LLTs. But if I don't want them, I can just untick it and just rerun my search, and it will rerun it without any blue boxes. If I'm interested in the numeric codes, I can go back up to my top panel and click on Show Codes and run it again. And now I see the numeric codes for my terms. So any questions on the demo?
We have a couple questions at the moment. The first one we have says, can we mention pseudoallergy as a diagnosis instead of itching and redness after receiving medication?
So you're talking about signs and symptoms and a diagnosis, right? So when we went back to the let me see the example. Okay, when we talked about signs and symptoms with a diagnosis. So the signs and symptoms that you received, I'm sorry, Hannah, what were they again? The signs and symptoms?
The signs and
pseudoallergy.
symptoms. Yeah, pseudoallergy as a diagnosis instead of itching and redness after receiving a certain medication.
Okay, so the report you received said the patient suffered from itching and redness after receiving a certain medication. That is the verbatim you received. So you received signs and symptoms after receipt of a medication. It's the recommendation from the ICH endorsed guidelines is to only code what you received. So only code your signs and symptoms. Do not infer a diagnosis, even though when you're looking at the signs and symptoms, even if you're kind of almost convinced that it is a certain diagnosis, the ICH endorsed guidelines will tell you don't make the diagnosis during the coding phase. You can, of course, query the reporter and clarify with the reporter, did you mean this particular diagnosis or not? And then if you receive that update, you can code accordingly. But if all you received are signs and symptoms, then you should only code what you received and can be backed up with your source data. But thank you for that question. Any other questions?
Perfect. I'm going to jump to the two questions we received about the browser demo, if that's okay. One asked, could you show the numeric codes again? And another asked if you could repeat how to access the synonym list.
Sure. Okay, so let me restore my defaults. So when you access the browser, the top panel that talks about your settings is defaulted to show you the non-current LLTs, but not show you the codes. So on the right-hand side of the top panel on the browser, there's a display options setting. And it has a box under the show codes. So if I want to see the numeric codes, all I need to do is click that box. And right away, if you noticed, in my hierarchy panel for my system organ classes, even my socks are now displaying the codes. And as I toggle open, I'm going to see codes at all levels, HLGTs, HLTs, preferred terms, as well as LLTs. So I can show my codes that way. I can even copy my codes. So if I right click any of my terms, I can copy my code, or I can copy my term if I'm interested to. And something I did not show you, when we talked about that seizure, and let's say I ran my search for seizure, and it outputted all those hundreds of terms as a possible option. It's just taking a bit more time because I'm sharing my screen. So when it's outputted all those hundreds of terms, let's say I want to show them to maybe a medical reviewer in my team, and they want to go through that list before they make a selection of which term to select for coding, or maybe they are choosing some terms for a query and so on. I can actually export this list. So if I have all of these 376 terms and I want to export them to an Excel sheet, I can do that. I can click export. And the tool will ask me just a few maybe default settings. Again, it's slow because I'm sharing and I have a few things open. So it will tell me that I'm including your secondary system organ classes. Do you want to keep that defaulted? Yes. And I'm including the grouping terms, HLT and HLGT. Do you want those? Yes. So if I keep it ticked yes, I'm going to be including the grouping terms as well as secondary system organ classes. But all of this information of all the different LLTs, PTs that have seizure, I can actually export them as an Excel sheet. So and it right away goes to my download area. So this is a very useful feature also in the browsers, is that it will export it. It will tell me which version it exported it in and all the different levels. So because I kept it defaulted to all the levels, it gives me in different tabs. This is my HLGT tab, my HLT tab, my PT tab, and my LLT tab. So it's very cool that I can export all of that to an Excel sheet. So that's the question about the codes. Was there a second question?
Yes, how to view the synonym list.
Okay, so the synonym list is defaulted to be used anyway. You don't need to activate the synonym list when you're in the browser. It's defaulted to be active. But if you're curious to see what it looks like, you see it right here with the link. So in this search box, in the search option box, you'll see the synonym list and you can expand it and take a look at it. But it is defaulted on when you're searching. You can untick it if you don't want it, of course, but I think it's very helpful when you're coding to keep your synonym list defaulted on. Any other questions?
Yes.
Because we do need to move on now to the coding examples.
Perfect. We'll do one more and then we'll save the rest for the next break. We had one that says, if you have the diagnostic term, for example, pancreatitis, do you have to code the single signs too if reported, or would you just code the diagnosis?
That's another good question. So oddly enough, this question comes up often. So I do want to show you where to find answers if you do want to share them with your team as well. So we said that the ICH points to consider document has a lot of information on different scenarios. So let me just walk you through the ICH points to consider document. So here's the ICH points to consider document. I'm going to pull it up for my purposes in PDF, and I'm going to go to the table of contents. And I want to see if I can find the table of contents where I have diagnosis with signs and symptoms, right? So that's the topic of this particular question. If I click on that, that particular section walks me through what is the ICH endorsed approach for this kind of scenario. So the ICH endorsed approach will tell you that if a diagnosis and the signs and symptoms are reported, you just need to code the diagnosis. But I will add an important caveat here. You need to make sure that the signs and symptoms reported are in fact all related to that diagnosis. They make sense. If there's something in there that is just way off and not related to that condition, then that's telling you something else is happening to that patient in addition to this diagnosis. right? So chest pain due to MI, you just need to code the MI. But if there's chest pain and eye redness due to MI, well, the eye redness is telling you something else is happening besides the MI, right? So that's for the diagnosis. Now, of course, if it's a provisional diagnosis, it's a little bit different because provisional means that it wasn't confirmed. So if you receive signs and symptoms plus provisional diagnosis, so you get the patient had some kind of chest discomfort and they were sweaty, we suspect it might be an MI, but we're running tests, then in that particular instance, the MedDRA points to consider do advise you to code everything because that provisional diagnosis might change. So I hope I answered that question, but it's, you know, it's just another kind of good reminder. So if you have a scenario, look in the ICH points to consider document. Maybe you'll find it there, and then you'll see the different examples and guidances that the document provides. Any other questions before we move on?
Let me find the next one. We have one that says, can you explain again when a cyst/polyp is primary SOC as neoplasm versus primary SOC as something else?
Okay, so let's see an example. Okay, so let's go with a cyst. And let's go with a cyst that has a particular adrenal cyst. So here's an adrenal cyst. Now, if I click on this adrenal cyst, it tells me that it has two linkages. It's linked to two system organ classes. It is an adrenal cyst, so it is an adrenal neoplasm. So that belongs to the endocrine body system, so the endocrine disorder. But it is a neoplasm. It is a benign neoplasm. So it is linked to neoplasms, benign, malignant, and specified. Now, the name of the SOC, I think it's what drives the confusion, because the SOC itself will tell you, I am a system organ class that captures neoplasms, whether they are benign, whether they are malignant, or whether they are unspecified. And I also am linked to cysts and polyps. The difference being that if the term itself is a cyst or a polyp, yes, it will be linked to the system organ class, but it won't be the primary link. The primary link will be to the site of manifestation of that particular cyst or that particular polyp. So yes, I can group them together, but I don't need that to be part of my amplified signal for malignancies, but may be product related because they're really benign. So I hope I answered that question. But so here's another example, an anal cyst. And if we expand, so another way to find all the information is to expand the toggle pluses. This is really slow today, so I apologize for that, or just click on it like we did with the adrenal cyst. And again, I see it linked to the neoplasm system organ class, but not as a primary link, as a secondary link. The primary is to the site of manifestation, which is the gastrointestinal. So I hope that answered that, but I do need to move on to the second part, which is the examples of coding. But if there are more questions from the user, please feel free to stay on, and I'm happy to address more at the end when we open it up for Q&A. Okay, so when we are assessing the reported information that we receive to select an LLT, there are a few things we're going to be asking ourselves. Do I know what kind of term I'm receiving? Is this a diagnosis, or is this sign or a symptom? Is it a test result? Is it an injury? Is it a surgical procedure? Is it a device issue? It can help me with my search. And like we said, some of them, we can go from a top-down approach if I know which system organ class I want to search in, and I don't want to use the search panel. So here's a coding example, and feel free to kind of test it out in the browser as we're talking it through, and see if you reach the same conclusion. So the report said that the patient suffered from an allergic reaction to an antibiotic. That's all the report said to me. If there was an allergic reaction to an antibiotic. So when I go to my browser, and let me close some of these tabs just to make sure that I enhance the quality of the tool. Okay, so I'm at my browser. I'm looking for an allergic reaction. And let's say I put allerg react as two separate words. I notice there's no exact match, of course, because I didn't put complete words, but I have these results at the bottom. And as I go through my results, I see allergic reaction, and I see allergic reaction to certain types of products like analgesics, antibiotics, but I also see allergic reaction to bee sting. I see allergic reaction to food. So I know that there are different causes that can lead to allergic reaction in people, and it's not just products. So if I toggle open this allergic reaction and see what the preferred term linked to it is, it's hypersensitivity. But if I look up the ones that to analgesics or antibiotics, it's drug hypersensitivity. So it's telling me right there that there's a difference in this medical concept between standalone allergic reaction and allergic reaction that specifies this is to an analgesic or to an antibiotic. And if I toggle these open, I can see which system organ class this belongs to. It is the immune system disorder, and it is the same system disorder, immune system disorder that the standalone allergic reaction codes to. But the idea here is that you want to capture as much information you received from your reporter. And if I find this drug hypersensitivity, it's more specific than standalone hypersensitivity. So going back to my example, my best bet here is to code this to allergic reaction to antibiotics, which is more specific. Here's another example. So the patient states she's been experiencing cold sweats. So let's go into my browser and restore defaults and start a new search. And I'm going to put in cold sweats. I spelled it correctly. Okay, cold sweats. So nothing came up. Okay, if I remove the cold, let's see what comes up. So I see drenching sweats and I see night sweats. Well, they're not the same as cold sweats. So maybe I can try it without the S and see what comes up. Now I have a bit more. I have 59, a lot of them. Do I have cold sweat? So I have cold sweat here. I see it here, but I see it not as a plural term. So if I click on it, I can see it goes to the preferred term cold sweat. It has more than one system organ class, so it links to skin as well as a general disorder. Okay, so if I go back to my verbatim said the patient says she's been experiencing cold sweats, and I found cold sweats not as a plural but as singular, but it is the same medical concept. So just a reminder that please be careful with plurals. They might exist in MedDRA at the LLT level as a singular term, not a plural term. Here's an example of lab results. So the lab results had increased troponin and increased CPK-MB. So these are two different types of labs. And if you look at the ICH endorsed guidelines, it will encourage you to follow the preferred option of coding each lab separately. And I know not all organizations follow that. So some organizations will code this to a grouped term, but the preferred option is to capture each lab separately because that's the information you're receiving. That's the level of detail that your reporter gave you. And if I look into my browser to look for that troponin, so let's say I put in troponin. So I'm going to split them up into two LLTs, and I'm looking for troponin increased. I see the troponin, but I want to see if I have increased. So I see different kinds of troponin, troponin C or I or T, but my verbatim did not specify which troponin. So I want a standalone troponin, and I see troponin abnormal. Well, it's abnormal, but can I find something more specific? I need something that says increase, and I do see troponin increased. Now notice I don't see an increased troponin. My verbatim says increased troponin. But if I look for it, let's see if I can look for it, increased troponin, and I hit enter. Now I see a lexical variance. So lexical variance basically means that MedDRA has found the words I put in, but not in the same order that I put them in my search panel. So it found troponin increased rather than increased troponin, and it's found all of these different terms that have the words troponin and the word increased in them, additionally to other words. So I think for my purposes, the troponin increased or increased troponin is equivalent, and I can use this LLT for coding, it takes me to the PT of troponin increased. Same for CPK-MB. So if I put CPK-MB, and I hit enter, it's going to tell me if it found CPK-MB as a standalone test or as abnormal or increased or normal, and I can choose the one that best matches my verbatim. So going back to my verbatim, the lab results indicate the patient has increased troponin and increased CPK-MB, and I found LLTs for both of them. So we're not lumping them as cardiac enzymes increased, even though some organizations may be tempted to code that, but that's not the preferred option per the ICH guidelines. Okay, so medication errors. So in this example, the patient accidentally took drug Y instead of drug X and became short of breath. So the report is telling me that something happened where the patient got confused and they accidentally took one drug instead of the other. So they took the wrong drug, and there was a clinical sequelae of shortness of breath. In the ICH endorsed guidelines, it is recommended that when you have both reports provided to you that there was a medication error and there was a clinical sequelae, to assign LLTs for both of them. So in this particular scenario, I want to capture not just the fact that there was a wrong drug administered, but also that there was a clinical sequelae. So if I want to start with the patient accidentally took drug Y instead of drug X, how would I think about that? So I know it's a medication error because in my concept description, and let me show that again under M for medication error, I know that this happened accidentally. So it was not intentional. And one of the main criteria of medication error is that this is unintentional. And I know it happened while the medication was in the hands of the patient because the patient themselves took the wrong medication. So this qualifies as a medication error. If I'm not sure where to start looking for medication error, I can just put in medication error and click enter. And I see medication error, but I know that it's not the most specific. Can I find more specific examples in MedDRA for these medication errors? I can right click. I can right click my medication error and tell my tool, take me to where this preferred term exists within the browser. So I'm going to go to browser. So I did right click with my mouse and I clicked go to browser. And now in my hierarchy panel, it opened up right to where that preferred term exists. So it's telling me this preferred term exists in the HLT, medication errors, product use errors, and issues not elsewhere classified. Okay, that's good, but I know what type of medication error it is. The patient took it. So I know that there was some kind of ingestion or administration happening. So I want specifically to look for administration errors because the patient actually took this wrong medication. I can toggle open the administration errors and I can look for all of these different, I can look through all of these different preferred terms and see if I can find something that explains in MedDRA terms what happened to my patient. The patient took drug Y instead of drug X. So he meant to take a drug, but he took the wrong one. And if I look through all of them, I might find the one that says wrong product administered. If I toggle it open, do I have an LLT that's the closest match to that medication error? Well, I know it's a drug because the source told me they took drug Y instead of drug X. So I can select the wrong drug administered. So I can think that this LLT is the closest to my reported source, to my reported verbatim. The wrong drug was administered. What about my shortness of breath? Well, it said short of breath. He became short of breath. So if I just type in short of breath and I hit enter, it's going to tell me I found the exact word, short of breath. It takes you to two system organ classes because it's linked to both the respiratory as the primary site of manifestation, but it can also be linked to cardiac disorders. Okay, so going back to my verbatim, took drug Y instead of drug X becomes the wrong drug administered, and the short of breath has its own exact match as at an LLT level. Here's another example. So a 2-day-old baby was noted to have a mild fever. So a 2-day-old baby with a mild fever. So if I go to my browser, and let me just go to my browser, and I restore my defaults, I'm looking for fever and baby and seeing if that combination exists in MedDRA. So there's no combination that has fever with baby. Well, what does fever go to? So there is an LLT of fever. And if I right-click the preferred term, I'm right-clicking pyrexia, and I'm going to see the surrounding events. Maybe within the surrounding events, I can find pyrexia for that particular age grouping. Maybe, maybe not. So here's my pyrexia, and it falls under my HLT of febrile disorders. And if I look through all of them, I wonder if I can find something that has a maybe a age grouping that matches a 2-day-old baby. So I do see febrile neutropenia. No, I see fever neonatal. So I see fever neonatal, and I think that can match as a better, more specific term for my report than just fever. So like we said, MedDRA is not intended to capture age groupings, but some age groupings, especially the neonatal age groupings, can have a preferred term qualifiers within MedDRA. So look for those if you're working in the neonatal age group. So in this particular example, this is the best match would be the fever neonatal for this report. Another example. So a 35-year-old woman was taking drug X to prevent relapses of multiple sclerosis. So we said MedDRA can be used for prophylactic indications. And just to show you that prevent in MedDRA, so the word prevent in MedDRA, if I type in prevent, I'm going to see things with or options with the word prevention, and they go from the LLT to the PT prophylaxis. So prevent and prophylaxis mean the same thing. And if I put in prevent multiple sclerosis, I'm not sure I'm going to find that. But maybe if I put prophylaxis for multiple sclerosis, I can find that. So that's another kind of way to search for terms, that if part of the term tells you it can be equivalent to another way to word it, you can look up the other way to word it in your search. So I know prevent in MedDRA goes to prophylaxis, or prevention in MedDRA goes to prophylaxis. So I can use prophylaxis within my search for the multiple sclerosis rather than prevention. So going back to my report, in this particular example, this would be the best match to the multiple sclerosis relapse prophylaxis. Okay, let's do another example. So the patient had pathological fracture of the neck of the femur. Maybe in this one, neck of the left femur. So maybe in this one, I can use my advanced search. I'm looking for a pathological fracture, and I'm looking for it in my femur. So because I put a lot of different parts of the verbatim, I was able to narrow down my search to only 2, because the third one is actually non-current. So I have pathological fracture of femur, which goes to pathological fracture, and I have pathological fracture of neck of femur, which goes to pathological fracture. So the closest one to my verbatim is the pathological fracture of the neck of the femur, even though it has the same preferred term, but the LLT is more specific. So I pick the more specific one. I noticed that laterality is not included in MedDRA, so I don't have left versus right femur. I mean, we do have left versus right in certain areas of the body. Think about, for example, the heart and the brain. But in terms of arms and legs and so on, it's not really needed to that level of specificity. So if I go back to my verbatim in this particular example, I found the LLT pathologic fracture of neck of femur to that level of specificity. Okay, so following the procedure, patient experienced several days of constipation. So in this example, let's see if I put in constipation. I'm going to go back to my basic search, and I'm going to put in constipation and see what I find. So I have standalone constipation, which is fine. This takes me to the PT constipation, and it's linked to the gastrointestinal system organ class as my system organ class, which makes sense. I mean, this is a GI concept, but this happened after her procedure. So do I have something that captures that level of detail? And if I look through the other search results that they found with constipation, I do see an option here for post-procedural constipation and post-operative constipation. And if I expand them, I see that they go to the same preferred term, but I want to be as close as possible to my verbatim. My verbatim says following the procedure. So I do like the post-procedural constipation, but which system organ class would this one go to? And if I click on it, I see it links to two system organ classes, and the primary is not gastrointestinal. So the reason behind that is that this particular constipation happened following the procedure. So it's a post-procedural constipation, and as such, the primary link would be to the injury, poisoning, and procedural complications system organ class. But it still gives me a secondary link to my gastrointestinal disorder, and this second link will allow me to combine these two together. If I have in my database constipation and post-procedural constipation, I can still see them together under my secondary links. So that's a way for me to still see them together. But the primary for the post-op constipation is the injury sock. That's the most specific. So in my example, following the procedure with constipation would be coded to post-procedural constipation. We'll do a couple more, and then we'll have hands-on exercises. So we'll do a couple more before we move on to the hands-on. So a 66-year-old man died from a ruptured aortic aneurysm. And the ICH endorsed guidelines do talk about death as an outcome or a serious criteria. Death usually is not itself the AE, but rather the underlying cause of death. So many organizations, when they receive standalone death, they will query for the underlying cause of death. However, MedDRA does have death terms if that is the only information that you received. But for this particular example, because I know the underlying cause of death, I'm only coding the underlying cause of death. So for this one, it would be the ruptured aortic aneurysm rather than the death. And I don't need to code death separately because typically death is captured elsewhere as an outcome in my database. There are, examples for product quality issues. So it was determined that the product was counterfeit. So if I go into my browser and I just put in, for example, counterfeit, I do see options for counterfeit products. My report does not specify that it was administered. So this would not be corroborated by the information I have. All I know is that the product was counterfeit. And notice that we have LLTs in the counterfeit option for suspected counterfeit product that actually carries over to the PT level as suspected. But my source did specify that it was determined, so I can just pick the product counterfeit. And this particular example goes to product issues. So just an example to show that product issues are available in MedDRA. If my patient was confined to a wheelchair, that's not really a medical condition. That gets me thinking of maybe social circumstances. So I could put in wheelchair or just wheel CH, and I can see that I have the option for wheelchair user within my social circumstances. So like we said, the social circumstances allows you to capture these kind of risk factors or scenarios or situations. Medication errors, there's a large group of medication error offerings within MedDRA. This just gives you an example of a stage of medication error in compounding. So the pharmacist made a mistake in compounding the medication. And usually in medication errors, we go top down. But if I also put in compounding, and I see if there's options for compounding, I do see compounding error versus compounding quality issue. And I know it's an error because the pharmacist did that. It happened during the process for medication use. So it was a product preparation error. And if you right-click on that and go to the browser, you're going to see a host of different types of HLTs with different stages of medication errors, dispensing, administration, monitoring, prescribing, and so on. Okay, and just as a reminder, MedDRA can help you code multiple parts of a narrative. So you have ability to code the medical history, the adverse events, the social history, any surgical procedures, and even post-op complications are all available in MedDRA. So now we're doing hands-on exercises. So just as a reminder, please access the browser, whether you have it on your end with your own credentials, or if you want to use the temporary credentials, try to find the best matching LLT, and you can either go from the top down in your SOC view, or you can use the search panel to go from the bottom up. And I'm going to remind you which the login for the Pole EV, because this is going to be also on the Pole EV, and we can get started with the first one. Okay, so she was diagnosed with pneumonia caused by COVID-19 infection. When you are searching within the browser, you want to take a look to see if you have a single term in MedDRA that captures all of the relevant information in your report. So can you find a term in MedDRA that captures all the relevant information here? She was diagnosed with pneumonia caused by COVID-19 infection. So let's see if folks are providing responses. Hannah, is it active, this poll, just to make sure? Yes.
Let me
Okay.
refresh.
Awesome. Thank
Yes.
you. Okay, so I do see responses coming in. So I see folks that have found options in MedDRA that captures both parts of the verbatim. So thank you so much. Yes, COVID-19 does exist in MedDRA, and pneumonia standalone does exist in MedDRA, but MedDRA also offers the option to capture both together. So there is COVID-19 pneumonia in MedDRA, and that would be your best choice because it has all the details. So yes, excellent. I'm glad to see that coming over. Well, what about the next one? So COVID-19 pneumonia is the correct LLT. Awesome. Here's the next one. The woman ingested her husband's blood pressure by mistake. So she ingested her husband's blood pressure by mistake. And I want to point out one thing a little bit different than the example we saw when we had that medication error. The patient who took drug Y instead of drug X was intentionally trying to take drug Y. This particular report is telling us that the woman ingested her husband's blood pressure drug by mistake. I don't really know whether she was intending to take her own medication and mix up the pills, or maybe that medication it looked like a lozenge, or maybe it looked like something else, and she didn't realize she was taking a medication. Just something to think about when you're looking up what the best LLT for this one would be. So here's the poll. Let's see if we can get some folks thinking about this. So we have accidental ingestion of drug. There's another vote for that LLT. That's wonderful. So you're finding the word ingestion. You know that she took it. One of the most important things to think about when you're looking at these kind of exposure terms or medication error terms is, did the patient actually end up taking the medication? It's very important to capture that. So this is wonderful. So I see the accidental ingestion of the product. The wrong patient received the medication. That's an interesting one, because the wrong patient received the medication is assuming that there was intentionality in the treatment here, that you intended to give this medication to somebody but gave it to a different patient. I wouldn't say that that is the best option for this particular scenario, because we don't know the intentionality of the woman when she took that drug. So accidental ingestion of drug would be the best one. It is an exposure term. Awesome. Okay, what about the next one? The patient developed hyponatremia while hospitalized. So the patient developed hyponatremia while hospitalized. Let's see if we find something in MedDRA that captures all the bits of information that I'm receiving in my report. So I have hyponatremia, and thank you for that option. One thing to point out is hyponatremia has more than one spelling in MedDRA. So when MedDRA was created, it was created based on an ontology that already existed in the UK. That's why the British spelling is the one used in the PT levels and higher. So one thing to kind of pay attention to when you are picking LLTs in MedDRA, even though the PT will not change, the PT is always the UK-based spelling, but you'll find US spellings in the LLT level in addition to UK-based spellings or English spellings. So you try to be as close as possible to your verbatim. So I see most folks are finding the right LLT. It did happen during hospitalization, so hospital-acquired, and it is hyponatremia. So I do have the hospital-acquired hyponatremia. And if you look up the hierarchy, you'll see that they're different, right? So you want to be careful when you're choosing an LLT that best matches your verbatim, because the hierarchy might be impacted. Let's do a couple more, maybe two more. The nurse noticed that the injection solution had an unusual odor. So the nurse noticed that the injection solution had an unusual odor. I don't think there was anything clinical as a clinical condition reported here. She just noticed that the injection solution had an unusual odor. So how would you start looking at this? The information you have is that there was an unusual odor. You may not find the word unusual, but maybe you'll find the word odor, and then you can find different options. So drug defect, product smell abnormal. Very interesting. Product odor abnormal, even more close to the verbatim. Device emits odor is a little bit tricky because it's an injection solution. There's no mention of a drug delivery system. So she noticed that the injection solution had an unusual odor. Okay, so I see a lot of different possibilities. So maybe this is a good one for the browser. I know it's not a clinical issue. I know it is a product issue because there's no clinical sequelae or medical condition being reported. It's not a device issue because the product is not a device. So if I toggle open the HLGT under product issues and I look at the possible different options, it's not counterfeit, there's not manufacturing issues, it's not a contamination or distribution or label or packaging, it's a physical issue. So if I expand my physical issue, I can start seeing different things that might make sense in my scenario. It's not a color, it's not a coating, it's not a taste, it's not a leak, it's an odor. So if I expand my product odor abnormal, I can see the product odor abnormal with an ODOR spelling and an ODOUR spelling. So the closest match to my verbatim is that the odor was abnormal because it had an unusual odor. And I know that injection solutions are product. How do I know this? If I look up my product concept descriptions and look up product can cover anything from drugs to biologics to vaccines to combination products, devices, nutraceuticals, and dietary supplements. So if I can't find specifically an injection solution as a product, and it's not necessarily existing in MedDRA, I can still use product. So there are coding terms that use the word product that I can use in my coding. So I hope that was clear that that's the best option. And let's do the last example. Elderly woman complained her arm was tender where she had received her seasonal flu vaccine. So the elderly woman complained her arm was tender where she had received her seasonal flu vaccine. I wonder if we have responses to come in. Her arm was tender where she received her vaccination site tenderness. That's very good. There's injection site tenderness. That's also good. Application site tenderness. Okay, so let's go to the browser. And I know that there was a site that was tender. And let's see if there's differences between them. So there's the application site tenderness. As an LLT goes to application site pain. There's my injection site tenderness, goes to injection site pain, and my vaccination site tenderness goes to vaccination site pain. So this tells me that I need to be very careful with my selection of LLT because it's going to impact my PT, which is my reporting level. So, but if I expand them all, where do they go to? So if I expand them all, I can see that they are all linked to the same two system organ classes, primary to the general and secondary to the injury. But my specific verbatim said that this was the site of her seasonal flu vaccine, so I know it was a vaccination site. So the closest LLT to this verbatim is the vaccination site tenderness. Well, this is the LLT. Okay, so let me go back to my example. And yes, the closest LLT to the verbatim is the vaccination site tenderness because it occurred at the vaccine site. Okay, we're right at the hour. We went over the scope, structure, and characteristics of MedDRA. We discussed coding conventions and the ICH endorsed guidelines. We showed the browser and went over some coding examples, and we're offering in the slides a few resources for you. I would like to open it up for Q&A. I know we're at the top of the hour, so those of you who cannot stay longer are welcome to drop off. Those of you who have questions are welcome to stay, and I'm happy to address them.
Perfect. Our first question says, how would you describe antimicrobial resistance in MedDRA?
So I don't know if we have it in the topic itself, but if you, and let me see if I can restore defaults and just put resist. If I put resist and I start looking for terms that have resist in them, I'm going to see a lot of different options. So there is, for example, antibiotic resistance test, and that's an investigation. There's a anti-malarial drug resistance, and that goes to malaria. So when you're looking for specific term like that, you need to understand the context of the term. So if you receive it as a resistance to, for example, anti-malarial, this would assume malaria as the most significant portion of the term. But it also has multiple system organ class connections. There's a bacterial resistance for pathogen resistance. So if you have a resistance to a pathogen itself, that also exists in MedDRA. So I think it depends on the amount of information. If you have it in your verbatim, I mean, we have standalone drug resistance, which just doesn't give you a lot of details. But if you have a specific type of drug, you can find resistance terms for that. So it's just a matter of searching through. And like I said, you can also export this into Excel and filter if that's easier to sort through if you get a large number of results. Any other question?
Perfect. We have two kind of similar questions that I'll add together about how do you know which LLT to pick when they are two very similar ones? For example, general convulsions and general seizure. How do you decide between two extremely similar LLTs?
Okay, so let's go to general and let's go to seizure, right? And of course, even though I put seizure, it is pulling up for me the one that says convulsions or the one that says seizures. So if I'm looking at generalized convulsions and I expand that, that goes to the preferred term seizure. If I have generalized, I'm not seeing a generalized standalone seizure. How about idiopathic generalized epilepsy? And then we have generalized epileptic seizures. So when you have similar terms, and I'm not finding generalized seizure as a standalone. Clonic, non-convulsive epilepsy, motor. So when you expand, if you find more than one LLT, when you expand the preferred term, if the preferred terms are different, like in this case, you have to be very careful with your selection that you are choosing the LLT that is the closest to your verbatim, because it's going to affect your preferred term. But sometimes your LLTs all go to the same preferred term. even in that instance, you are still selecting the LLT that is closest to your reported verbatim, but in that instance, there's no impact on your PT level. So that's a very good question, because just finding an LLT that is close, and there's a couple of them, doesn't mean you can pick either of them. You need to be careful that the one you're picking is the closest to your verbatim, because there is a chance that even though they're close to each other, they could impact the preferred term, and you don't want to change that signal. So that's a very good question. Thank you for that. Any other questions?
Perfect. Similar question with regard to the short of breath example. How do we decide to code as short of breath instead of shortness of breath? Is it just because the former is an exact verbatim match?
The short answer is yes. So let's go back to short of breath, right? So the actual verbatim that we got from the source said he became short of breath. So in MedDRA, I do see an exact match for short of breath. If I expand that, that goes to dyspnea. But I also see shortness of breath, and if I expand that, that also goes to dyspnea. So in this particular example, my selection of my LLT is not going to change the signal, it's not going to change the preferred term, but I want to be as close as possible to my verbatim. So I picked short of breath rather than shortness of breath, but they both take me to the same spot, the same dyspnea. There's no difference in the hierarchy. But thank you for that. Any other questions?
Perfect. If a patient experiences 2 episodes of the same event, do you recommend to code the event twice or only once?
So those kind of questions are really based on your internal approach in your database capture. So, some organizations have a visit by visit reporting design. Some of them have a single AE, and you can have details of the AE in your narrative. So if they overlap in a certain period, and you want to report them from the start date of the first one through to the next one, and you can call it intermittent. So that's really up to your internal organization decisions, as long as you are being consistent across the board. So I can't really give you a standardized approach for that. Any other questions?
We're receiving a lot of questions. Just as a reminder, we can't specifically tell you how to code something. We can give general principles, but if you're sending in case reports, we cannot specifically code that for you. I apologize. Let me sort through the several that we've received.
And just as a reminder, please be careful sharing real adverse event information. You may also want to make sure that you're not sharing real adverse event information with us on the call. I mean, it's good to have hypotheticals and things like that, but please refrain from giving us real clinical data that may not be shareable. And also, we're not, as Hannah said, we're not going to be giving coding responses to specific reports. We don't know your product. We don't know your internal coding guidelines, and it's not in your best interest for us to receive a real report and give you a response.
All right, I think we've got, let's see, when pharmacokinetic parameters come into the picture as an event related to drug example, speed of absorption in the case of the drug absorption impaired scenario. I don't know. Let me see. If you could clarify that question, that would help us. Based on the question for short of breath, because physicians looking at coding tend to fall on their judgment, so we should stay as close to the reported verbatim as possible. Is that correct?
So it's not just because of the physicians. I mean, your source data may or may not be coming from somebody with a medical background or a healthcare professional. It may be coming from the patient themselves. It may be coming from somebody close to the patient. So your source data, the origin of that source data is not necessarily a physician. So, but your job as a coder is to select terms within MedDRA that don't add information or remove information from your source. So you're trying to stay as close as possible to the original reported verbatim, even to the level of the word itself, if it's complete or not, short versus shortness, even to the level of the order, even to the level of the spelling, if you receive something in US spelling versus UK spelling. So your job as a coder is to stay as true as possible to the source, because you want to be able to corroborate it from your source. So don't add information, don't remove information, and try to be as close to the verbatim as possible. Just code what you receive. So even to this example, so short versus shortness, because the reported source verbatim said short of breath, we matched it. We have it in LLT. If we didn't have it, then we can consider shortness of breath. But we have that particular example as an LLT in MedDRA. But thank you for that question. Any other questions?
Perfect. The only other ones I am seeing are asking us how to code certain scenarios.
Okay. Okay, awesome. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time. We do hope that you came away with useful information for you in your coding journey. And we do advise you to check out our listings for further webinars on advanced MedDRA coding, which we hope to offer soon. So please take a look at that offering, and hope to see you again in upcoming webinars.